Welcome to Marx 813. This is Bernard Harcourt, and this is the full-length introduction to the seminar Marx 813 on Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon and Engels' Revolution and Counterrevolution in Germany, 1848. We interrupted our last seminar with the publication by Marx in November 1850 of a series of articles in the New Rhenish Gazette on the French Revolution of 1848 and the first few years of the French Second Republic. Articles that Friedrich Engels had collected and published under the title Class Struggles in France, 1848-1850. Those first 2 years of the French Revolution of 1848 had already complicated the landscape for Marx and Engels, the landscape that they had painted in the Communist Manifesto published in February 1848. And Marx had already engaged in several important recalibrations of the manifesto by the time that he writes Class Struggles in 1848. First, so in those 1850 articles, Marx dramatically refined and enriched the analysis of class struggles that he had already sketched in the Communist Manifesto. The simple binary of bourgeoisie versus proletariat had given way to a far more nuanced analysis. The bourgeois class itself was now divided and internally conflicted between the financial aristocracy, so financiers and bankers in one camp, the industrialist and manufacturing bourgeoisie in another camp, the large landholding property owners in another, all separate and at odds with the petty bourgeoisie, which consisted of shopkeepers and merchants. Marx developed a far more nuanced analysis of the proletariat class as well, with the emergence of a lumpen proletariat that the bourgeoisie would instrumentalize as a militia against the workers. It's in Class Struggles, actually, that Marx wrote the most about the lumpen proletariat. In addition, the rural populations take a far greater importance and are divided and dissected into the rural workers, who he calls the peasants, the small property owners, the large farmers, who together form what Marx qualifies as the vast majority of the French population. So from a binary theory about two classes struggling throughout history, recall the famous opening of the manifesto, right? Free men and slaves, patricians and plebeians, barons and serfs, sworn masters of journeymen, in a word, oppressors and oppressed in constant opposition, who waged an uninterrupted war, sometimes overt, sometimes covert, a war that always ended either with a revolutionary transformation of the whole society or with the destruction of both classes in struggle. Remember, that's how he opened the manifesto. Two classes struggling throughout history. Well, he already had proposed in Class Struggles in 1850 a far more fractured civil war model with multiple actors forming and breaking coalitions and alliances. It was far more nuanced historical account already. Second, Marx had updated his analysis of capitalism. In his early work, Marx had given the impression that the financial dimensions of capitalism were parasitic of the industrialist elements, of the factories, of the workers. Marx felt that the core of capitalism was the industrial form, which was crucial for revolutionary change because it was the factory workers who would rise up and crush the bourgeoisie. It was the factory workers who would be the bourgeoisie's own grave diggers. In Class Struggles by 1850, by contrast, the financial bourgeoisie and bankers play a central role both in the collapse of the July monarchy and at each stage of the February Revolution. And the path forward for communism now turns in part on the doings of the financial bourgeoisie. Now, this would lead Marx back to the drawing board in his studies of political economy. And in a letter to Engels from the early 1950s, Marx tells Engels that it's time to get back to work. Of course, that's the work that he would start with the Grundrisse, 1857-1861, in which finance capitalism is a very delicate issue. We'll be turning to that next at the next seminar. The Grundrisse starts with a chapter on money, aimed primarily against Proudhon, and creates a sharp distinction between those who work and those who make money. And of course, this will be developed in Capital, Volume 1 in 1867, especially in Chapter 4 on the two concepts of surplus value One is the increase of monetary value, the other as the increase of work. More on that later. Third, Marx is already beginning to anticipate in 1850 a longer trajectory to communism. Recall that in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels had proclaimed the imminent death of capitalism. The contradictions of capital had rendered the survival of the capitalist modes of production impossible. Capitalism was in its end stage. It could no longer feed its workers. The end was near. Well, not so near, the revolution of 1848 would reveal. Marx was chastened by the events of 1848, especially by the bloody June days in June 1848, when the Parisian workers who had risen up in arms against the bourgeois republic were crushed. But by the end of that period, in November 1850, Marx still seemed to express some hope for a proletarian uprising in alliance with the petty bourgeoisie and the rural populations. The National Assembly had just restored a wine tax at the end of 1849 at the urging of the Bonapartist ministry, and the rural populations felt betrayed by Louis Napoleon, whom they believed they had elected to the presidency. As Marx wrote, quote, "Little by little, we have seen peasants, petty bourgeois, the middle classes in general, stepping alongside the proletariat, driven into open antagonism to the official republic and treated by it as antagonists." Those words were published probably around March 1850. They appear in the third article, and the final articles were published in November 1850. That was 1850. Then came 1851, of course, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'etat. Louis Napoleon at the time was president of the Second Republic, elected by a landslide in December 1848. And for anyone who needs a primer, again, on French history, I gave it last time in my introduction to Marx 713. So please go there. Near the expiration of his term-limited presidency and facing huge debts, Louis Napoleon seizes power in a coup d'etat on December 2, 1851, and proclaims for himself another 10 years as president at the head of the French Republic. In a plebiscite that he calls shortly thereafter, 92% of the male suffrage supports his new mandate. This essentially paves his path to becoming emperor, and 1 year later, to the day, on December 2nd, 1852, Napoleon III is declared emperor of the French. Now, meanwhile, in Austria and in the German states, a revolution has come and gone, as have others in Hungary, Italy, and elsewhere on the continent. Many of the defeated revolutionaries have fled in exile to the United States. Marx is approached by editors in New York to write about the French and the German revolutions, and that gives rise to two important texts. Engels' 19 articles on the German situation, published in the New York Daily Tribune between October 1851 and October 1852 under the title Germany, Revolution and Counterrevolution. And second, Marx's 7 articles on the French Revolution, published in Joseph Weidemayer's Die Revolution in New York in 1852 under the title The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. These two texts discuss not only the revolutions in France and Germany, but more importantly, perhaps for us today, the counter-revolutions that prevailed throughout the continent. Now, we are living right now in the first weeks of the second Trump presidency through the triumph of a new offensive of the American Revolution. And it's critical that we study and understand this moment. And few texts are more important to do that than Engels' Revolution and Counterrevolution in Germany and Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. So we're going to turn to those texts today in the context of our own counterrevolution. And to enrich our understanding, we will place the two texts in conversation with Herbert Marcuse's book, Counterrevolution and Revolt, published in 1972 at the time of a previous triumphal offensive of the Counterrevolution under the Nixon administration in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement and during the Vietnam War protests. At our seminar, we will be focusing really on our ongoing counter-revolution in this country, how to understand it, and how to put it in conversation, what lessons to learn from Marx and Engels and Marcuse. For purposes of this introduction, though, I will focus on the two Engels and Marx texts and Marcuse in order and give the background on those texts, so to prepare everyone for the seminar. So let me start then with Engels's Germany, Revolution and Counter-Revolution, which was written 1851, 1852. A little background on those articles. In early 1851, Marx is approached by an editor at the New York Daily Tribune, Charles Dana, to contribute articles to the newspaper. Marx agrees, and he will begin a decade-long correspondent relationship with the Tribune that will last until 1862. Marx publishes under his byline a series of 19 articles in the Tribune from October 1851 to December 1852 about the German Revolution of 1848 and 49, which, as you will recall, the German Revolution erupted first in Vienna, in Baden, and then in the German states in mid-March 1848, a few weeks after the Parisian uprisings of February 1848, and it eclipsed with the dissolution of the Frankfurt National Assembly in May 1849, and then the military defeat of the May insurrections, which occurred in the middle of July 1849. So it lasted from about March 1848 to July 1849. Now those 19 articles were later collected, edited, and published by Marx's daughter, Eleanor Marx Aveling, in 1896 under the title Revolution and Counter-Revolution, or Germany in 1848. At the time of that edition, Eleanor Marx Aveling did not have access to the Marx-Engels correspondence. And what the Marx-Engels correspondence reveals is that it was actually Engels who was the one who drafted those articles at Marx's request. In a letter dated August 14, 1851, Marx asked Engels to write, quote, a series of articles about Germany from 1848 onwards. Engels agreed and drafted the set of articles based on almost daily correspondence with Marx and sent them to Marx. According to the editors of the Marx-Engels Complete Works, Engels used as the main source of reference a file of the New Rhenish Gazette, apart from some additional material given to him by Marx, whom he constantly consulted and who read every article before mailing it. The articles were then published in the Tribune in New York under Marx's byline and a general heading, Germany, Revolution and Counter-Revolution. Each article was numbered and thus did not carry titled captions. All right, a little bit about the text. Engels kicks off the articles with the kind of flourish we're used to from Marx, declaring the revolutions of 1848 dead and over in Germany. The opening line sets the tone. The first act of the revolutionary drama on the continent of Europe has closed. Engels follows that up in the opening of the next paragraph by referring to the most, quote, signal defeat, unquote, of a revolution one could ever possibly imagine. Now, although the revolutions on the continent were roundly defeated, Engels, like Marx in Class Struggles, focuses on the positive, on the silver lining. The revolutions achieved a change of consciousness. People throughout Europe now understood that these revolutions were not the product of a handful of extremists, but the sign of real social unrest and demands in the face of what Engels called outworn institutions. In other words, Engels argues the revolutions transformed the public sphere, plus their repression only made them stronger and more likely to succeed the next time around. So as with the manifesto and as with class struggle, Engels' articles are a call to arms. They are intended to motivate revolutionary fervor, and Engels himself implicates himself. He's engaged in the struggle. He's not merely describing what happened, he's calling for the next revolution. As he writes, "If, then, we have been beaten, we have nothing else to do but to begin again from the beginning." And it's, of course, important to realize that many German, Hungarian, and other revolutionaries fled the continent in 1849 with the defeat of the revolutions and found exile in New York and the United States, and would have counted themselves among the readers of the Tribune and of these articles. Engels emphasizes that defeat is a driving force in revolution. Rehearsing a main theme from class conflicts in France, Engels argues that revolutionary losses represent the fuel of the revolutionary movement. He writes, quote, "A well-contested defeat is a fact of as much revolutionary importance as an easily won victory." He goes on to say, by means of illustration, that the defeats of Paris in June 1848 and of Vienna in October certainly did far more in revolutionizing the minds of the people of those two cities than the victories of February and March. This actually leads him to argue that in November 1848, the Assembly and the people of Berlin should have fought the Prussian army in the streets rather than delivering themselves and their city to the incoming soldiers. He writes, "The Assembly and the people of Berlin would probably have shared the fate of the two towns above named, Paris, Vienna, but they would have fallen gloriously and would have left behind themselves in the minds of the survivors a wish of revenge, which in revolutionary times is one of the highest incentives to energetic and passionate action. It is a matter of course that, in every struggle, he who takes up the gauntlet risks being beaten. But is that a reason why he should confess himself beaten and submit to the yoke without drawing the sword?" So you see, the articles really reflect this idea that a loss can be as important as a victory, and that at times it's important to sacrifice yourself. The articles reflect Engels' passion for war strategy. Engels sets forth strategic principles for an insurrection, such as the need to always stay on the offensive and to always act with audacity. He writes, quote, "Insurrection is an art quite as much as war as any other, and subject to certain rules of procedure, which, when neglected, will produce the ruin of the party neglecting them." These passages are resoundingly military in strategy. Revolutions are won or lost, Engels argues, on decisiveness, on offensiveness, on resolution, on showing a strong front, on attacking, on being on the offensive, on, quote, "the highest necessity to stake everything on the decisive moment, whatever the odds may be." As Engels writes, in the words of Danton, the greatest master of revolutionary policy yet known, "De l'audace, encore de l'audace." Audacity, audacity, still more audacity. Engels focuses the reader's attention on those decisive moments, often decrying the revolutionaries for their lack of courage, for their lack of resolve, and for their lack of strategic acumen. This is especially so regarding the final defeat of the revolutionaries in the summer of 1849, marked by the, quote, "often inconceivable panic in the revolutionary army." Engels denounces the slovenly, stolid leadership of revolutionary commanders. Everything was got into confusion. Every good opportunity was lost. every precious moment was loitered away with planning colossal but impractical projects, Engels laments. But he also recognizes the symbolic and contagious effect of some decisive moments. One of them is actually the bloody June defeat of the Parisian workers, which ricocheted throughout the continent. Engels argues that the crushing defeat of the workers in Paris energized the counter-revolution across Europe. He writes, "The proletarians of Paris were defeated, decimated, crushed with such an effect that even now they have not yet recovered from the blow," he writes, and continues. "And immediately all over Europe, the new and old conservatives and counter-revolutionists raised their heads with an effrontery that showed how well they understood the importance of the event being the June defeat. The press was everywhere attacked, the rights of meeting and association were interfered with, every little event in every small provincial town was taken profit of to disarm the people, to declare a state of siege, to drill the troops in the new maneuvers and artifices that Cavaignac had taught them." And it was from that moment on, Engels suggests, that the counter-revolution in the German states got the wind in their sails. For the first time since February, he writes, the invincibility of a popular insurrection in a large town had been proved to be a delusion. The honor of the armies had been restored. The troops, hitherto always defeated in street battles of importance, regained confidence in their efficiency, even in this kind of struggle. From this defeat of the ouvriers of Paris may be dated the first positive steps and definite plans of the old feudal bureaucratic party in Germany to get rid even of their momentary allies, the middle classes, and to restore Germany to the state she was in before the events of March. So it's a fine kind of strategic analysis, arguing for forms of sacrifice that can kind of nurture the revolutionary spirit, but also recognizing, right, that the defeat, the bloody defeat in June of the French proletariat had an effect throughout all of Europe and had emboldened all of the counter-revolutions. In the articles, Engels identifies the parts played by every different class and the struggles between and within those classes, in both the revolutionary struggles and in the counter-revolutionary reactions. He describes the feudal nobility, which by contrast to France and England had, in Germany, retained most of their ancient privileges, still at mid-century. He analyzes the backward manufacturing bourgeoisie in Germany and how it had become part of the liberal opposition. In fact, he even describes the place of German philosophy and literature and Hegel's philosophy of right and of the young Hegelians to show the emergence of a liberal ideology of constitutional monarchy that fueled a confrontation with the various monarchs of the German states. He writes, German philosophy, that most complicated but at the same time most sure thermometer of the development of the German mind, had declared for the middle class, by which he means the bourgeoisie, when Hegel in his philosophy of law pronounced constitutional monarchy to be the final and most perfect form of government. Engel adds to explain, in other words, Hegel proclaimed the approaching advent of the middle classes of the country to political power. So his argument basically is that German philosophy had nourished the liberal opposition to feudalism in Germany. Engels, in these passages, actually also even gives a short genealogy of the Rhenish Gazette that Marx had edited in Cologne from 1842 to 1843, and of course which we discussed in Marx 2:13. It's a fascinating little passage because we get a kind of a politicized history of the Rhenish Gazette. In other words, a politicized history of Marx's role in all this. Engels writes, in the Rhine provinces, and more or less generally all over Prussia, they, he's referring to the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, were so exasperated that they, being short themselves of men able to represent them in the press, went to the length of an alliance with the extreme philosophical party of which we have spoken above, the young Hegelians. The fruit of this alliance was the Rhenish Gazette of Cologne, a paper which was suppressed after 15 months' existence, but from which may be dated the existence of the newspaper press in Germany. This was in 1842. An interesting kind of reflection on Marx's role in creating a newspaper press in Germany through the Rhenish Gazette originally in 1842, and that role in the political conflict and in the class conflicts that would arise. We can place a landmark here for our future discussion of ideology and of cultural studies, especially of Stuart Hall's British School of Cultural Studies, which I'll come to later on. Now, Engel writes as well about the petty tradesman and the shopping class, so the petty bourgeoisie, which he considered to be, quote, the leading class of the insurrection of May 1849. The working class, which he describes as more akin to small tradesmen of the Middle Ages, also took up arms following what he calls its only true policy, namely to allow no class that has risen on its shoulders, as the bourgeoisie had done in 1848, to fortify its class government without opening at least a fair field to the working classes for the struggle of its own interests. So we see here kind of the relationship between the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, who are the ones who lead the insurrection a year later in May 1849, and the working class, on the other hand, which joins as well, though is not viewed as the leading class, but does so in order to not allow the bourgeoisie to take advantage of what it had done already. He also describes the rural classes, the country folk, and he describes the whole swath of rural populations, from the large and wealthy property owners and the small freeholders to the feudal tenants and the agricultural laborers. He talks about the way that the rural populations joined the fight in 1849 because, he says, because of the relative enormous load of taxation and the feudal burdens pressing upon them. So he does the kind of class analysis that we saw Marx do in Class Struggles in France in 1850, looking at every class and seeing how they work together and how they fracture internally as well. He acknowledges the difficulty of revolutions in the way that when they are successful, they immediately lead to those fractionalism, to internal conflict and collapse. No sooner is the victory gained against the common enemy, Engel writes, that the victors become divided among themselves into different camps and turn their weapons against each other. But at the same time, Engels argues that the failures push history forward in a revolutionary direction. They trigger the internal class divides and the antagonisms, but those produce progress and they motor history. He writes, "It is this rapid and passionate development of class antagonism which, in old and complicated social organisms, makes a revolution such a powerful agent of social and political progress. It is this incessantly quick upshooting of new parties succeeding each other in power, which during those violent commotions makes a nation pass in 5 years over more ground than it would have done in a century under ordinary circumstances." One might ask where Engels gets all that optimism and that idea of progress. And I think the answer is, first, from the belief that repression really does invigorate revolt. As he writes, every attempt at forcible repression will only bring it forth stronger and stronger until it bursts its fetters. But a second reason, and perhaps more importantly, I think he gets it from the materialist theory of history that he and Marx have been developing, namely from the idea that society must go through these phases of capitalism and industrialization in order to ultimately achieve communism. In other words, there's a necessity to this path, a path that's full of defeat, but necessary defeat in order for history to take its course and to ultimately achieve communism. Now, at this time, it's important to recognize that Engels is at the height of his interest in military strategy and revolutionary and counter-revolutionary histories. He's just come off the barricades at Baden. He fought and he was defeated. He was defeated in the Battle of Rinthal in June 1849 in the Palatine, and he had just escaped to Switzerland. So he's writing about events that he witnessed firsthand, in fact, that he participated in. And he's now plunging himself at this time in the study of military strategy, or as the editors of the collected works write, immersed himself in studying the art of war. These articles really reflect his fascination with revolutionary military strategy. Engels will eventually distance himself from the arts of war. And by the time he writes his 1895 introduction to Marx's class struggles in France, he has a much less sanguine view of street fighting. Let us have no illusions about it, he emphasizes there in 1895. A real victory of an insurrection over the military in street fighting, a victory between two armies, is one of the rarest exceptions. Engels then explains how the relations of forces have tilted in favor of the armies, in favor of the counter-revolution, and then he concludes, does that mean that in the future street fighting will no longer play any role? Certainly not. It only means that the conditions since 1848 have become far more unfavorable for civilian fighters and far more favorable for the military. In future, street fighting can therefore be victorious only if this disadvantaged situation is compensated by other factors. Accordingly, it will occur more seldom at the beginning of a great revolution than at its later stages, and will have to be undertaken with greater forces. These, however, may then well prefer, as in the whole Great French Revolution, or on September 4 and October 31, 1870 in Paris, the open attack to passive barricade tactics. For the Engels, what's clear from this passage is that for the Engels of 1895, revolutionary workers need to be much more careful about taking to the streets with arms and far more strategic about it. As he writes, the time for surprise attacks of revolutions carried through by small conscious minorities at the head of masses lacking consciousness is past. Now, these are my words, different tactics will need to come to the fore. And those include, as Engels writes, slow propaganda work and parliamentary activity. In 1895, Engels extols the electoral encroachments of the German Social Democrats and its 2 million voters, and warns against undermining that progress by street fighting that would only bring about repression and a bloodbath. Engels remarks how the communist revolutionaries are becoming far more successful, and properly so, through the ballot box than through the gun. He writes, the irony of world history turns everything upside down. We, the revolutionaries, the overthrowers, we are thriving far better on legal methods than on illegal methods and overthrow. Those are his words in 1895. Of course, that's a very different Engels talking in 1895 than the one from Revolution and Counterrevolution in Germany, where we really see him arguing for military strategies, decisiveness, and always taking the offensive. Okay, let's move now to Marx's text, the 18th of Brumaire of Louis Napoleon. A little background on the publication of that text. In the immediate wake of the coup, which was in December 1851, from that immediate time afterwards to mid-February 1852, it's about 2 months, Marx writes 7 articles on the events surrounding the 1848 revolution under the title The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. These articles were intended for serial publication in a weekly newspaper, but they were published instead all together in spring 1852 in a monthly paper called Die Révolution, The Revolution, edited in New York by Joseph Weidemeyer, a longtime friend and collaborator of Marx. At the time, when he's writing them in the beginning of 1852, Marx is living in London, where he had moved with his family after being expelled from Germany by the Prussian government in May 1849. He has just finished editing and publishing the last issue of the new Rhenish Gazette, which was in November 1850, and he's mostly immersed at this point in his economic research and his journalistic writings. In the preface of the 1869 edition of the 18th Brumaire, Marx provides some background context regarding the writing of the text. He writes, "My friend Joseph Weidemeyer intended to publish a political weekly in New York starting from January 1, 1852. He invited me to provide this weekly with a history of the coup d'etat. Down to the middle of February, I accordingly wrote him weekly articles under the title The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Meanwhile, Weidemeyer's original plan had fallen through. Instead, in the spring of 1852, he began to publish a monthly, Die Révolution, whose first number consisted of my 18th Brumaire. A few hundred copies of this found their way in Germany at the time." He continues, "From the above facts, it will be seen that the present work took shape under the immediate pressure of events, and its historical material does not extend beyond the month of February 1852. Okay, now, and just recall, Napoleon seizes power in December 1851, but he's declared emperor a year later, December 2nd, 1852. So these articles were written and published smack in the middle, or at the beginning of those two events, after the coup, but before his imperialization. Now, there's another important text, which is a letter that Marx writes to Joseph of Weidemeyer in March of 1852, at about the time of the publication of the 18th Brumaire. That's worth getting a sense of to put everything in context, because in that letter to Weidemeyer, Marx specifies exactly what his contribution to the theory of class struggle consists of. Okay, and it's a fascinating paragraph. Again, dated March 5th, 1852, and Marx writes the following: "And now as to myself, no credit is due to me for discovering the existence of classes in modern society, or the struggle between them. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this class struggle, and bourgeois economists the economic anatomy of the classes. What I did that was new was to prove, first, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Second, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. And third, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society. 3 propositions. Fascinating. 3 propositions, he suggests, were his. The idea of class struggle, bourgeois historians had invented, had figured out. The bourgeois, the economic anatomy of the classes, the bourgeois historians and economists had figured out. But Marx takes credit for 3 things. Okay. First, the first thesis, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historical phases in the development of production. Marx established this was something that Marx had already established in the 1848 Paris manuscripts, right? That he had already established in the 1845-46 Brussels manuscripts, the German ideology, and that he also written about in the Communist Manifesto. In all of those works, Marx demonstrated that the proletariat was only born with industrialization and that the proletariat did not exist before industrialization, so that the existence of classes is bound up with particular historical phases in the development of industry and production. So that had gone back at least to 1844. The second thesis, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat, I think we find pretty well in the Brussels manuscripts, again, the German ideology, and in the Communist Manifesto. The third thesis, that this dictatorship itself only constitutes the transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society, I think we find clearly in the Manifesto. But all 3 at this point are clear to Marx and undergird his analysis of the 18th Brumaire, of the coup d'etat of Louis Napoleon. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the significance of the text, the 18th Brumaire. And I'll start by focusing really on its central thesis. In his preface, in Marx's preface to the second edition of the 18th Brumaire, which was written in 1869, Marx emphasizes the central thesis of the work, which is, namely, to demonstrate that the rise of Napoleon III was the product of class struggles in France and not anything associated with a great man story. Now, the famous sentence that encapsulates the argument is the one where Marx states that his objective in writing the articles, and he says this in 1869, his objective in writing the articles was to, quote, demonstrate how the class struggle in France created circumstances and relationships that made it possible for a grotesque mediocrity to play a hero's part. Now, we readers tend to emphasize the humor in that sentence, the idea of a grotesque mediocrity and the kind of witty attack and critique of Napoleon III. But we emphasize the humor at the expense of the theoretical thrust of the sentence, because the important point is that the entire account in the 18th of Brumaire is a study about class struggles and how they played out, not about the rise of an individual, nor about Louis Napoleon himself. Marx is emphasizing that this is not a traditional great man story, not even the story of a grotesque mediocrity's rise to power. The engine of history is entirely the social conflicts, not the individual. Marx attacks the 2 other books on the coup d'etat that had drawn most attention at the time, those by Victor Hugo and by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and he attacks them precisely for turning the individual, Louis Bonaparte, into the agent of history, when in fact he is not the main actor of history, which instead is the proletariat and the other classes in conflict. Now, it's interesting to note that Engels had done the same in the articles on Germany, namely to show that the revolutions, as well as the counter-revolutions, he writes, were not the work of single individuals, but spontaneous, irresistible manifestations of national wants and necessities, more or less clearly understood, but very distinctly felt by numerous classes in every country. The political project is to make people understand the larger forces at play, right? That's Marx's political project in the 18th Brumaire. That was Engels' political project in Germany, Revolution and Counterrevolution, to make people understand the larger forces at play, rather than simply the kind of the glimmering gem, which was Napoleon III. And to understand the larger forces so as not to be blindsided now or in the future. Marx specifically targets the idea of Caesarism. He criticizes any parallel between the rise of Napoleon III and the rise of the Roman emperors. This is not a story about emperors, nor about the desire or lust for imperial power, nor about the desire to have an emperor, what you might call Caesarism, because the conditions were totally different in ancient Rome. In ancient Rome, the enslaved population was purely passive. It played no role. According to Marx, Caesar may have been the product of class struggle, but one that only involved the privileged. He writes, the class struggle took place only within a privileged minority, between the free rich and the free poor, while the great productive mass of the population, the slaves, formed the purely passive pedestal for these combatants. By contrast, at mid-century in France, in 1848, the proletariat, the working class, is the active participant in the class struggles. So the analogy to Rome, to the rise of Caesar, to rise of emperors, or to Caesarism is entirely inopposite. What is important to understand in mid-century France is precisely the role of the proletariat in class struggle, which serves as the engine of history. And this is completely different than the Roman period, where the enslaved persons played no role. In referring to Sismondi, Marx writes, the Roman proletariat lived at the expense of society, while modern society lives at the expense of the proletariat. And that being the case, there is nothing in common between the Roman experience and the French coup d'etat. Again, and this goes again to the central point of the 18th Brumaire, which is to detail the class conflicts that made possible the rise of Napoleon III. And it's not surprising that Friedrich Engels would call the earlier writings from 1850 class struggles in France, of course, which is what we studied last week. In fact, perhaps it's even worth repeating here the great law of motion of history that Engels discussed in his preface to the third edition of Class Struggles. Now, of course, we have to discount Engels' over-enthusiasm and take his formulation with a grain of salt, but I think that it reflects the basic idea that Marx was trying to get at. So we can read his argument about the great law of motion of history a little less dogmatically, less rigidly, less scientifically than Engels wrote it. But there isn't there the grain of what I was just talking about. Engels writes that what Marx discovered and what permeates the 18th Brumaire is, quote, the law according to which all historical struggles are in fact only the more or less clear expression of struggles of social classes. All right, so that's the first point. The second point is that these class struggles, he writes, are in turn conditioned by the degree of development of their economic position, by the mode of their production, and of their exchange determined by it. So the second point here is that the classes and the relations between the classes are determined by modes of production and this applies to all historical struggles, whether they're political, religious, philosophical, or in other ideological domain. And we can see here, going back to the letter that Marx wrote to Wiedemeyer, that this is the important point, right? That not only are the classes themselves historically situated, but the class struggles are historically situated as well. We can criticize Engels for trying to render too scientific Marx's thought or too law-based, but I think that's effectively the core of Marx's contribution in the 18th Brumaire, its analysis of how class struggles themselves, shaped by economic relations of production, serve as the law of motion of history. Okay, so in those 7 articles, Marx gives a historical account, and right in the first article, Marx delivers a succinct history of that historical account, a history of the French Revolution of 1848, and he does it in 3 phases. So the first period, which dates from the outbreak of the Parisian uprising in February 1848 to the meeting of the National Assembly in May 1848, is what he refers to as the provisional transition period. It witnesses the overthrow of Louis-Philippe and of the July monarchy, and it witnesses the temporary establishment of a provisional government, a period in which everything is considered provisional. During this first period, all of the different social classes and actors, from the bourgeoisie to the petty bourgeoisie to the workers, form part of the provisional government. So none, in effect, stands out. He writes, "Nothing and nobody ventured to lay claim to the right of existence or of real action." All right, so that's the first period, what he calls the provisional period. The second period, from May 1848 to the end of May 1849, witnesses the defeat of the workers during the bloody June days and the establishment of the bourgeois republic. In the bourgeois republic, Marx says, the entirety of the bourgeoisie rules for the people, by contrast to the earlier bourgeois monarchy under Louis-Philippe, the July monarchy, in which only parts of the bourgeoisie had ruled in the name of Louis-Philippe. This occurs as a result of the crushing of the Parisian workers in June 1848. Marx characterizes the June insurrection as, quote, the most colossal event in the history of European civil wars. And Marx details the different classes and the different interests that united to defeat the workers. Those different classes include the finance aristocracy, the industrial bourgeoisie, the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, these are his words, the army, the lumpen proletariat organized as the mobile guard, the intellectuals, the clergy, and the rural population. All of those populations stood unified against the workers, who were by themselves. They stood none but by themselves. And the result, of course, was brutal and bloody. More than 3,000 insurgents were butchered after the victory, Marx writes, and 15,000 were deported without trial. And with that, the proletariat would no longer play an important role in the following developments. Basically, they would recede and go off the stage. Marx contends that the proletariat turns instead, at that point, to more limited, autonomous, and self-contained projects like workers' associations and exchange banks that are separate from larger society, what might be thought of as cooperative projects among workers. He speaks of a proletariat movement, quote, in which it renounces the revolutionizing of the old world by means of the latter's own great combined resources and seeks rather to achieve its salvation behind society's back in private fashion within its limited conditions of existence. This actually sounds very much like the forms of cooperation that could serve today as an alternative to capitalism. In the place of the workers, he says, there rises the dictatorship of the pure bourgeois republicans. It is, though, a short-lived dictatorship, set aside in a matter of months on December 10, 1848, by the election of Louis Napoleon as president of the Second Republic, and later, on May 28, 1849, by the exit from the stage of the Constituent Assembly. And that's the end of the second period. The third and the final period, from May 28, 1849, which was the date of the opening of the Legislative National Assembly, to December 2nd, 1851, when Louis Napoleon conducts his coup d'etat, Marx characterizes as the period of the Constitutional Republic. The period of the Constitutional Republic. It is marked by three periods itself. First, in the months from May to June 1849, by the defeat of the petty bourgeoisie at the hands of the bourgeoisie and Louis Napoleon. Second, a period of parliamentary struggle, ending with the abolition of universal male suffrage with the law of May 31, 1850. And finally, the last months of the Republic that mark the end of the bourgeois rule and the restoration of empire. All right, so let's talk for a minute about the importance of the text itself. Napoleon's coup and the writing of the 18th Brumaire would settle a few things for Marx, at least temporarily. First, Marx is far more clear in this text that the rural populations are in fact a reactionary force. They play a decisive role in the crushing of the proletariat and the rise to power of Louis Napoleon. Marx is really hard on the peasants in the 18th Brumaire. As he writes, Bonaparte represents a class, and the most numerous class of French society at that, the small holding peasantry. Just as the Bourbons were the dynasty of the big landed property, and just as the Orleans the dynasty of money, so the Bonapartes are the dynasty of the peasants, that is, the French masses. Not the Bonaparte who submitted to the bourgeois parliament, but the Bonaparte who dismissed the bourgeois parliament is the chosen man of the peasantry. Marx then launches into a long disquisition attacking the French peasantry. Long paragraphs of the final article really serve to eviscerate the rural populations. They are, he writes, incapable of enforcing their class interests in their own name, whether through a parliament or a convention. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Their representative must at the same time appear as their master, as an authority over them, as an unlimited governmental power that protects them against the other classes and sends them rain and sunshine from above. The political influence of the small-holding peasant, Marx writes, therefore, finds its final expression in the executive power subordinating society to itself. And note, of course, that this is the passage that Gayatri Spivak famously deploys in Can the Subaltern Speak? To discuss the question of representation, of being represented, focusing on the different German words that Marx uses, and to tie the discussion of the 18th of Brumaire and the use of this question of representation, of course, to the representation of the subaltern and whether the subaltern can speak in their own voice. Now, it's in this context that Marx develops a theory about the distinction between a class in itself and a class for itself. This is a hotly contested distinction. Some people praise the distinction, others criticize it, still others do not believe that there even is such a distinction in Marx. But scholars mostly have pointed to a passage in the 18th Brumaire, which they usually accompany with a passage from the Poverty of Philosophy, where Marx expressly used the term a class for itself. The passage in the 18th Brumaire is where Marx writes, criticizing the rural populations. He writes, "Insofar as millions of families live under economic conditions of existence that separate the mode of life, their interests, and their culture from those of the other classes, and put them in hostile opposition to the latter, they form a class. Insofar as there is merely a local interconnection among these small-holding peasants, and the identity of the interest begets no community, no national bond, and no political organization among them, they do not form a class." And so this is used, as well as the passage from The Poverty of Philosophy, where Marx uses the term a class for itself to draw a distinction between a class that can be considered kind of descriptively as a class if they have similar interests, and or on the other hand, a class without any community or political organization that doesn't yet form a class for itself. Of course, this raises then important questions as to how a class becomes a class for itself, and of course, what are the different stages that are required to pass from a class in itself to a class for itself. And this would give rise to a lot of writing. Okay, so the first thing, Marx kind of really critiques the rural populations and categorizes them as reactionary forces. Second, Marx also recognizes that while there are revolutionary elements among the proletariat and among the artisans, there are also many workers who are reactionary. Not all of them are radicalized. Not all of them are revolutionaries. Following the June defeat especially, the proletariat disappoints. Marx writes, "The more important leaders of the proletariat in the assembly and in the press successively fall victim to the courts, and ever more equivocal figures come to its head." And then he writes even more caustically, "It seems to be unable either to rediscover revolutionary greatness in itself or to win new energy for the connections newly entered into." So the second point is that we see here kind of and you can hear it throughout the 18th Brumaire, at times certain forms of disillusionment with the proletariat. Third, Marx entrenches in this text the more nuanced analysis of classes that he had already developed in Class Struggle in France. The conflict is no longer binary. There are multiple different groups in society. It forms a civil war. Whereas earlier in the Brussels manuscripts in the German ideology, for instance, Marx consistently spoke of a binary polarization of society, and for instance, in the ancient communal context of the relations between citizens and slaves, and the subsequent polarization between cities and the country and whatnot, in the Communist Manifesto as well. Here we've got this very nuanced model of class analysis that's based on complex civil war. I'd say, of course, that this isn't something that Marx is explicitly referring to as a shift, and it's also something that's not going to be permanent. One has to understand in Marx's works this ebbing and flowing, and these shifts over time, and you have to realize that any coherence or any permanence is just academics trying to impose some sense to the different periods of Marx's writings. Later on, there's going to be a more linear, schematic that resurfaces, for instance, in the 1859 preface from the Critique of Political Economy, which takes up again a more linear history, similar to the Brussels manuscripts, the binary opposition of classes, the progression of ancient feudal and capitalist regimes, a more simplified class analysis, but again, we will again find more duality and polarization in Capital, especially in the passages discussing the laws of populations and the proletarian product. But here we're at the point, perhaps, the greatest point of fragmentation and nuance in the analysis of class struggles. Fourth, Marx develops a more refined comparison of the bourgeois versus the proletarian revolutions. He has more material to theorize now. The bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century he characterizes as dramatic but short-lived. They, he writes, storm swiftly from success to success. Their dramatic effects outdo each other. Men and things seem set in sparkling diamonds. Ecstasy is the everyday spirit, but they are short-lived. Soon they have reached their zenith, and a long, crapulent depression seizes society before it learns soberly to assimilate the result of its storm and stress period. By contrast, the proletarian revolutions of the 19th century are far more agonistic, self-critical, demanding of themselves, and self-questioning. He writes, they criticize themselves constantly, interrupt themselves continually in their own course, come back to the apparently accomplished in order to begin it afresh, deride with unmerciful thoroughness the inadequacies, weaknesses, and paltriness of their first attempts, and recoil again and again from the indefinite prodigiousness of their own aims. These proletarian revolutions are not satisfied with any talk about what they have accomplished, nor any mere claims. They want to see things being done, and they know people by their deeds. Borrowing from Aesop's fable of the boastful athlete, Marx famously writes, Hic rodus, hic salta. Here is the rose, here dance. In other words, right, prove yourself. If you were expecting to prove yourself at Rhodes, as in Aesop's fable, then this is Rose. Prove yourself now. Fifth, it's about at this time, I would say that Marx sets aside the notion of ideology. Ideology had been important in the 1845, 1846 Brussels manuscripts, in the German ideology. Even if I argued there that it was more about ideologues than about ideologies, still, it played a big role. And Marx already started to move away from it in the Communist Manifesto, where there's no real use of the concept of ideology. Again, he mentions ideologues, but not ideology. But after the 1848 revolution, Marx will not really return to the idea of ideology. As Etienne Balibar emphasizes in his reading of Marx, Althusser may not have been entirely correct with regard to his hypothesis of an epistemological rupture in Marx in 1845. But there certainly was a rupture, and Balibar places it at around 1848 and the Revolution, after which Marx decides that he needs to break with the past and not focus on ideology, but instead buckle down and really study political economy. Overall, Marx ends on an optimistic note in the 18th Brumaire, always finding the silver lining in the defeat, always seeing the necessary progress of history. The centralization of power in the executive with Napoleon III, Marx views as a positive and necessary step forward for the revolution. Because, in fact, the revolution now has a singular target, right? All the power is now united in the hands of the emperor. Like the political revolutions of the 18th century, which faced off against a king and a monarchy, the locus of power is now centralized for the proletariat revolution to target. And so Marx writes famously, "But the revolution is thorough. It is still journeying through purgatory. It does its work methodically. By December 2, 1851, it had completed one half of its preparatory work. It is now completing the other half. First, it perfected the parliamentary power in order to be able to overthrow it. Now that it has attained this, it perfects the executive power, reduces it to its purest expression, isolates it, sets it up against itself as the sole target in order to concentrate all its forces of destruction against it. And when it has done this second half of its preliminary work, Europe will leap from its seat and exultantly claim, 'Well-burrowed old mole.'" And that, of course, going back to Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, is this idea that the revolution is now a living force that continues on and on, that burrows itself, but that comes back out. It's this idea of the old mole is the same idea that Marx had in Class Struggles when he says, "The revolution is dead, long live the revolution," right? The revolution now has two bodies. It can die, but it will live again. It is permanent in some sense. It is the old mole. It is burrowed, if we're not seeing it today, but it will come out again. And when it does, Europe will leap from its seat and exultantly claim, as he writes, "Well-burrowed old mole." Okay, that's the 18th of Brumaire, but of course I'd be remiss not to mention that the 18th Brumaire is also where two of the most iconic passages and quotations of Marx were published first, two passages that are connected. The first, of course, is the opening line of the essay. Hegel remarks somewhere that all facts and personages of great importance in world history occur, as it were, twice. He forgot to add the first time as tragedy, the second as farce. Now, Marx is referring, of course, to the relationship between Napoleon and Napoleon III. And the second most famous line opens up the second paragraph, where he writes, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generation weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living." And the second passage is connected to the first, since it's the weight of the dead generations that makes people borrow from the past and create from tragedy a farce. Of course, but readers have projected much more onto that second passage, having to do with Marx's account of history. But I think that it's more narrowly tied to the first claim. In any event, it'd be shirking responsibility not to include those passages in any introduction of the 18th of Brumaire, since they are some of the most quoted passages of Marx in history. Well, what happens after, in the aftermath, is, you all know, a few months after the publication of the 18th Brumaire, 1 year, day for day after the coup d'etat itself, on December 2nd, 1852, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte is declared Emperor of the French and takes on the name Napoleon III. This time, the plebiscite of male voters favors the new emperor by 97%. At the same time, capitalism takes off. There's an economic boom with the imperialism of France. The Suez Canal opens. The finance and the financial capitalists do extremely well. There's a lot of retrenchments. on the part of the revolutionaries in England. The Chartists become reformists, and it's at this moment, in the midst of all of this, and some of these disappointments, that Marx retools and returns to work on political economy. As you know, there's going to be one other historical episode that will return Marx to this kind of historical, political, journalistic writing, and that's the Commune. And we'll get to those writings when we turn to his work, Civil War in France, which he wrote during the Paris Commune, during the Revolution, after the Revolution, but about the Paris Commune of 1870 and 71, during the Revolution of 1870 and 71. Okay, now I wanted to say a few words about Stuart Hall and his analysis of the 18th of Brumaire. We were going to be studying Stuart Hall with Kendall Thomas at the seminar, but unfortunately, for personal reasons, Kendall wasn't able to join us. So we set aside Stuart Hall, but he had brilliant writings on the 18th of Brumaire. And I thought I would just say a word about that, even though we're not really going to touch it during the seminar. Stuart Hall considered Marx's 18th Brumaire as a model for cultural studies. So it really is worth taking a moment to discuss his reading. And before I do, I just want to give some background on British cultural studies. Hall gives a marvelous genealogy of the formation of British cultural studies in lectures that he delivered at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in 1983, and that are published under the title Cultural Studies 1983, A Theoretical History. And there he gives a genealogy, really, of British cultural studies from its inception in the 1950s and early 1960s to the time that he's lecturing in 1983. He emphasizes how cultural studies in England grew out of a moment of reflection in the 1950s during a period of economic affluence in England in the post-Second World War period, and that cultural studies responded to the question of the transformation of the working class during a period of capitalist affluence. In his words, it addressed a very concrete political problem and question. He says, what happened to the working class under conditions of economic affluence? So cultural studies in England grew out of the work of literary criticism at first, especially that of Richard Hogarth and Raymond Williams, who both applied a thick literary critical reading to cultural phenomena. It grew out of literary criticism and close readings, but eventually began to borrow tools from other disciplines, such as anthropology and sociology, so that the intellectual movement extended its close reading to political and economic and cultural and social phenomena, not just texts. At the time, Marx and Marxism were dangerous for intellectuals. This was during the Cold War and the censorship of leftist ideals and ideas in the West. It was only after the revolution, defeat, and invasion of Hungary in 1956, and the birth of a new left movement, that cultural studies began to more explicitly embrace Marxist cultural theory and the framework of class analysis. But it was always in deep tension with more economistic or scientific Marxisms, especially the Marxism of Althusser, because cultural studies always wanted to emphasize the degrees of freedom of culture and of social meaning. It always took as its target and point of deepest contradiction the Marxist theory of base and superstructure. For this reason, the cultural studies movement always privileged the earlier Marx of the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, the more humanistic philosophical Marx, the Hegelian Marx. Cultural studies engaged more that early humanistic Marx, the Marx writings that, as Hall writes, gave a much wider reach to the elements of consciousness, to the questions of human needs. So the question of base and superstructure was always at the heart of cultural studies, since it focused on those elements that were supposedly superstructural, and did so in a way that gave them forms of autonomy that rejected the idea of determinism. As Hall writes, the distinctiveness of the Marxist version of cultural studies is surely that it finds a way of thinking the domain of cultural production, the domain of the symbolic, in relation to the material foundations. In these lectures, Hall traces the intellectual movement through Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson and Hogarth, through the early stages of the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies that Hogarth established at the University of Manchester and that Hall inherited and took over as director in 1969 when Hogarth left for UNESCO. His genealogy highlights the three key dimensions of cultural studies. First, the fact that it was born as a political project, or as Hall writes, as a way of analyzing post-war advanced capitalist culture. So it was first a political project trying to understand how the cultural and social dimensions were interacting with the political and economic. The second dimension is its basis in literary criticism and the application of literary criticism techniques to cultural phenomena, especially in Stuart Hall's work to phenomena like youth cultures in Britain, the emergence of different kind of cultural forms among the youth in Great Britain. The third dimension is the influence of Marx's philosophical writings, especially the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, as a way to motivate the new left. In an important chapter, the fourth lecture, titled Rethinking the Base and Structure, Stuart Hall takes on directly the problem of culture as superstructure. Hall is adamant in rejecting a theory of ideology grounded on a notion of false consciousness. He wasn't alone. E.P. Thompson was also adamantly opposed to the ideas of false consciousness. Hall's main criticism is that the idea of false consciousness always seems to apply automatically to other people and not to oneself. As he writes, I wonder how it is that all the people I know are absolutely convinced that they are not in false consciousness, but can tell at the drop of a hat that everyone else is. So this is again a part of the rejection of the base superstructure model, since ideology, of course, naturally fits in the superstructural zone. Now, it's in this context, when he's discussing base superstructure, that Hall takes on, at length, Marx's 18th Brumaire, which he treats as a model for cultural studies, especially insofar as it rejects the more mechanistic model that will be articulated in the 1859 preface from the Critique of Political Economy or in the introduction to the Grundrisse. Hall argues that the task is to push Marx's analytic work from capital towards the analysis of real social formations, and he argues that Marx did that best and provided the best model in the 18th Brumaire. He writes, one of the best examples of how that kind of analysis would be done is precisely the 18th Brumaire. So he proposes an analysis of the model of the 18th of Brumaire. He shows how targeted it is on the specific historical conjuncture, how it highlights the variety of social and political forces that had conflicted in a sharp way, and how such a model includes more detail and relief than if one focused only on modes of production. All of a sudden, he suggests, and by contrast to the Communist Manifesto, we see the army, priests, officials, lawyers, writers, and journalists appear as real political forces, as well as the great landowners, the industrial bourgeoisie, the financial bourgeoisie, the industrial proletariat, the peasantry, and the lumpen proletariat. All of these factions, he says, and micro-classes come into focus in the articles and displace the simple binary opposition between the bourgeoisie and proletariat. Quote, "The language of politics in the 18th Brumaire is never a language of whole classes ruling over other whole classes." So the analysis is far more nuanced than the determinism, especially the determinism of vulgar Marxism. Quote, "The relationship between classes and political organizations cannot be described at the level of the determinacy of the mode of production," he writes. "It requires a quite different kind of analysis." And, of course, in that analysis, meanings become important, understandings as well. And this does not mean, Hall emphasizes, that modes of production are irrelevant. No, instead, Marx does the nuanced job of incorporating financial capitalism and industrial capitalism in the rural economy. Hall claims that, quote, "The determination is extremely weak, extremely distant. We can only say it establishes certain limits within which the political relates to the economic, that it sets limits and open possibilities, possible forms, including some that were not tried during that time." So it's a remarkable passage by Hall, giving a really textured analysis of the 18th Brumaire and using it as a model for his own work, for his own cultural studies approach. He concludes the paragraph with a stunning passage, which I'll read here. He writes, "There is a relationship here between base and superstructure, between classes and the emergence of new structures of political power, but the analysis is radically different from an attempt to apply the classical base superstructure model in a straightforward way. The model that Marx actually employs does have a place for social contradictions, other than those which arise from the contradiction between capital and labor. The analysis is built centrally upon references to social movements, social groupings, alliances, and blocks which do not have a clear class character, although it is clear that the intrinsic language of the analysis remains decidedly materialist. The 18th Brumaire, then, offers an alternative to the classical base superstructure metaphor without giving up the ground that the metaphor has won." Okay. So that helps us, Hall really helps us to understand the import and the contribution of the 18th Brumaire. Now, at Marx 813, we will focus on the ongoing counter-revolution in the United States. I've written about that in a book called The Counterrevolution, although that book was published in 2018, and since then, what we've seen is a new front and a new victory for the counter-revolution, which is astounding and stunning and taking place right now. I'm speaking 3 weeks into the new mandate, the second presidency of Donald Trump, who is taking a bulldozer to the federal government, has tried to stop all federal payments, has eliminated U.S. AID, is trying to transform and eliminate the regulatory federal state, and has engaged in massive deportations and has been started sending people to Guantanamo. So we're in the middle of an ongoing counter-revolution, and that's how we're going to be reading these Marx and Hegel's texts. And it's also why I suggested that we read Herbert Marcuse's text, Counterrevolution and Revolt. Marcuse was writing in 1972 in the face of another overwhelming wave of the counter-revolution at the tail end of the Nixon administration. And so the parallels are important, and the ways of understanding that Marcuse offers are particularly important today. Marcuse's book, Counterrevolution and Revolt, is a radical update and counterpoint to Marx and Engels' writings on the counter-revolutions of 1848-52. Writing in 1972, Marcuse argues that the United States and Western Europe are in a new phase of counter-revolution, representing the culmination of the development of capitalism. If Lenin spoke of imperialism as the final stage of capitalism, it's fair to say that Marcuse describes the counter-revolution as the newest stage. In the bold formulation of the first sentence of the book, Marcuse declares, quote, "The Western world has reached a new stage of development. Now, the defense of the capitalist system requires the organization of counter-revolution at home and abroad." This is going to happen a lot. Herbert Marcuse, argues in this book that the current stage of capitalism has created the need for counter-revolutionary practices. As he writes, the bourgeois democratic phase of capitalism terminates in the new counter-revolutionary phase. Marcuse makes clear that the new form of counter-revolution being waged by the West is as extreme as fascism and Nazism, even though it differs from them and retains the veneer of a certain liberalism. History does not repeat itself exactly, Marcuse emphasizes. So to be sure, like earlier counter-revolutions, the present incarnation of the counter-revolution in 72 involves torture and massacres at the worst level. Marcuse is referring, for instance, to the slaughter of student protesters in Mexico City, to the shooting of students at Jackson State and Kent State, to the assassination of black militants like Fred Hampton and George Jackson. He's describing the police and CIA operations in the United States under the Nixon administration and abroad. But there's a difference with the counter-revolutions of 1848 and 49. Marcuse suggests that the current counter-revolution, by contrast to those earlier ones, is not a response to a revolutionary insurrection. And so in this regard, the current situation differs markedly from Marx's and Engels' writings. Marcuse is clear that the counter-revolution in 1972 is preventative. It does not follow from a revolution, but instead is the product of the fear of a revolution. Marcuse writes, quote, "The counter-revolution is largely preventative, and in the Western world, altogether preventive. Here, there is no recent revolution to be undone, and there is none in the offing. So there's no revolutionary uprising like that of the Parisian proletariat in February or June 1848, or the German workers in March 1848 or June 1849, that could be pushing capitalism towards a counter-revolution. It's only the fear of a revolution. Fear of revolution, he writes, which creates the common interest, links the various stages and forms of counter-revolution. So the counter-revolution, he says, runs the whole gamut from parliamentary democracy via the police state to open dictatorship, and it's the product of deliberate capitalist organization in the face of the threat, not the reality of a revolution. In part, the counter-revolution is evidence of fear among capitalists. According to Marcuse, there is a sense that capitalism is unable to satisfy the needs which it creates. There is a sense that trouble is on the horizon. It's to offset those risks that in the United States, the Nixon administration is turning to law and order and at the same time putting itself above the law. Capitalism, he writes, reorganizes itself to meet the threat of a revolution which would be the most radical of all historical revolutions. It would be the first truly world historical revolution, he says. But that is not really in the offing, he has already told us. Marcuse equates what is going on in the 1970s with the totalitarian and fascist crackdowns of the mid-20th century, but he's careful not to suggest that the American regime is fascist. it demonstrates, in his words, a proto-fascist syndrome. And it may well lead to a fascist phase of the counter-revolution, but it hasn't yet. So in effect, Marcuse argues that the current counter-revolution is, first, tainted by fascist tendencies, and second, possibly veering towards fascism. In perhaps the most ominous passage to read, in light of today's events, Marcuse suggests that the counter-revolution may be headed towards a fascist phase. He writes, quote, "Decisive is rather whether the present phase of the preventive counter-revolution, so its democratic constitutional phase, does not prepare the soil for a subsequent fascist phase." This is truly chilling to read today. Perhaps even more chilling, he writes, citing William Shirer in the Los Angeles Times, that, quote, "We may well be the first people to go to fascism by the democratic vote." Well, we could stop there and start the seminar. Those are ominous passages that resonate eerily today. But it's against this backdrop that Marcuse then analyzes what today's revolt should look like. He argues that the only counterpoint to the counter-revolution has to be an organized radical left. Marcuse is writing in the wake of the emergence of the New Left and other countercultural movements on the left, including the hippies, women's liberation movement, sexual liberation, and various socialist and Marxist variations, including notions of cultural revolution, Maoism, new forms of anarchism, and other radical movements on the left. Marcuse offers a Marxian analysis of the conditions of capitalism that is somewhat critical of aspects of the New Left, critical especially of a certain petrification of Marxian theory on the left. The critique here is that Marxist theory has become ritualized and applied in a cookie-cutter way, and that needs to be rethought, in part because the contemporary conditions for practice have been completely altered. Marx suggests that the West in the 1970s is in a uniquely different conjuncture for revolutionary action and revolt. As he writes, quote, "The present situation of the New Left is essentially different from the period during which the radical opposition took shape and had its first nationwide effects." He is referring to the civil rights movement, war resistance, college protesters, and the hippie movements of the 1960s. Things have changed, he says. Back then, he argues, the establishment was not prepared for those forms of revolt. He writes, quote, "The strategy then could be massive, open, and largely offensive, mass demonstrations, occupation of buildings, unity of action, juncture with the black militants," he says. But those times, he tells us, are past, because the establishment now is prepared with much more aggressive repression and political and military force. Echoing what Engels had written already in the late 1890s, Marcuse proposes that the military and police power are too massive for there to be the kind of mass demonstrations and occupations that occurred in the 1960s. In fact, he goes so far as to say that the goal of seizing state power is less realistic, perhaps no longer realistic. The strategy of seizing state power can no longer be the objective, he writes. "I have referred to the notion, today widespread among radical groups of the New Left, that seizure of power in the sense of a direct assault on the centers of political control, the state, backed and carried out by mass action under the leadership of centralized mass parties, that such strategy is not and cannot be on the agenda in the advanced capitalist countries. The main reasons are, 1, the concentration of overwhelming military and police power in the hands of an effectively functioning government, and 2, the prevalence of a reformist consciousness among the working classes." Faced with a new situation, Marcuse favors a shift towards decentralized organizations that are grassroots-based and subversive. He speaks of a, quote, shift to decentralized forms of organization, less susceptible to destruction by the engines of repression, and more expressive of the divergent and dispersed nuclei of disintegration. Monopoly capitalism, he writes, has given a new concrete sense to the revolution from below. Subversive grassroots. So what he's proposing is decentralized forms of subversive action that are more spontaneous and contagious and serve to disintegrate society, to subvert it. He argues for different forms of praxis, including autogestion and autonomia for workers to take control in the factories, along the lines of Italian theorists like Antonio Negri. He views that as a way to gradually change economic power before changing political power. Much of that discussion assumes, of course, a revolutionary working class. And even though Marcuse is somewhat cautious about the working class, I'd say he remains somewhat overly sanguine, especially in light of today's working class. He is drawing parallels to workers' councils on the model of Soviet councils and favors self-determination, self-government, so autogestion. But he also speaks about other forms of disruptive practices, including disruption of court procedures and peaceful occupation of buildings and heckling of speakers. He's not opposed to what he calls desperate acts that are doomed to failure because they can have symbolic force and significance, but he does seem to favor most the idea of autonomous, local-based and local bases, especially in the university. He views the university as a special place for the education of future counter-cadres. Marcuse favors the creation of counter-institutions in the media and the university. He endorses the radical leader of the German SDS, Rudi Dutschke, and his idea of, quote, the long march through the institutions, the long march through the institutions. The idea is to become part of institutions, but to subvert them, to turn them into counter-institutions from within. And this is how he describes it in his words, quote, working against the established institutions while working in them, but not simply by boring from within, rather by doing the job, learning how to program and read computers, how to teach at all levels of education, how to use the mass media, how to organize production, how to recognize and eschew planned obsolescence, how to design, etc. Right? So learning, and at the same time preserving one's own consciousness in working with the others. Marx is adamant about training students, the counter-cadres, and creating critical thinking, which critical thinking is the essential tool to resist domination, he argues. Halting the eternal return of domination and submission, he argues, presupposes knowledge of its genesis and of the ways in which it is reproduced. And that calls for critical thinking. Marcuse offers especially a toolkit then of disruptive, subversive grassroots praxis, and argues that it may be up to those in the university and in other counter-institutions to form the revolution. He ends the first section, the first substantial part of the book, titled The Left Under the Counterrevolution, on these words: capitalism produces its own grave diggers, but their faces may be very different from those of the wretched of the earth, from those of misery and want. And what he's trying to suggest here is that the college students, professors, the educated, may be the agents and motors of revolution, more so than Fanon's idea of the wretched of the earth. So let me stop here on Marcuse for now, and let me end this introduction. Let me end this actually where Marx ends the 18th Brumaire, which is where we will start the seminar, because it is so frighteningly current. So let me quote Marx to close. Driven by the contradictory demands of his situation and being at the same time like a conjurer under the necessity of keeping the public gaze on himself as Napoleon's substitute by springing constant surprises, that is to say, under the necessity of executing a coup d'etat en miniature every day, Bonaparte throws the entire bourgeois economy into confusion, violates everything that seemed inviolable to the revolution of 1848, makes some tolerant of revolution, other desirous of revolution, and produces anarchy in the name of order, while at the same time stripping its halo from the entire state machine, profanes it, and makes it at once loathsome and ridiculous. Welcome to Marx 8:13.